Okay, welcome back to part 2 of our chapter 19 lecture on gangs. And if you recall, we left off speaking about the different types of records to keep, the gang file and the gang member file. We talked about the importance of photographs and information on vehicles, being able to cross-reference the gang file and the gang member file. And we also talked about the importance of field interview cards and gang cards. And finally, those booking sheets at either county jail or state prison, where they have the individual answer several questions. One, specifically, that section 8 that I showed you talks about gang affiliation. And that's good information for us to use during our investigation. So let's go ahead and move into the actual investigation. What are some things that we can do to perhaps have a successful investigation regarding illegal gang activity? So the most common way to gather information about gangs is internal contacts with patrol officers and detectives, followed by departmental records and computerized files, and also by reviewing the in-house police reports. One other thing that's super important to remember is that patrol officers are an essential source of gang information. Because they are out there day after day answering calls, stopping and interviewing and speaking to people, they're going to glean a lot of information. And through all of those field contacts and observations, they can supply you with not just confirmation of an individual's gang membership, but also information and intelligence on the gangs, the gang members, and maybe which gangs are fighting against each other. So that's really important for us to know, because it's going to help us later on in our investigations if we know which gang is fighting with which gang. Now, illegal activities of gangs usually involve several suspects, so multiple suspects, and that's going to make things more difficult. Evidence may link only a few of the suspects with the crime, and just like with organized crime figures, gang members maintain this fierce loyalty to each other, and a lot of times they're not going to want to rat out their buddy, right? So maybe you have 2 or 3 of the suspects involved in a drive-by shooting, and you're looking for 1 or 2 more. Chances are they may not tell or rat on the other person. And gangs, particularly those that are highly organized, can be very mobile, which is going to present another challenge to investigators. Now, an excellent resource for investigators that work these types of gangs and gang crimes would be the National Alliance of Gang Investigators Association. This association provides a forum for officers in jurisdictions throughout the country to share information and intelligence. So it's a great way to kind of share and with everybody, and you can see if similar things are happening in different jurisdictions. Now, most of the witnesses to gang-related crimes are gang members themselves, or people who at least sympathize with the gang, which is going to present a challenge to investigators trying to extract credible information from such individuals, as these witnesses may deliberately lie or mislead investigators and protect the suspects. Now, other witnesses who are not gang involved may be too afraid to provide information, maybe because they live in the neighborhood with the gang and they might fear for their safety. And they may provide information and then later deny that they said it. So for you as an investigator, if people do provide you with information, make sure that you tape record it or videotape it. So that way later on, if they try to recant their story, you'll be able to have that information. So again, special challenges in investigating gang activity includes the multitude of suspects, the potential of mobility of the members, and the unreliability or fear of witnesses. And one last thing on that, because they are gang members themselves, a lot of times, as I said, they may not be reliable, but they may not be credible either, which are two different things. But it's important to you. Okay, so gang investigations overall should be carried out like most other criminal investigations, and uniformed officers should establish personal contacts with gangs in the community and become familiar with their size, the names and monikers of as many of the members as possible, and each gang's identifying symbols, colors, and graffiti. It's really important that you start to build your knowledge base on that. Now, as it relates to the scene, the immediate area in which a crime occurs may yield a lot of information. So, and there's going to be some challenges as well. Any graffiti present might indicate which gang controls that territory. And keep in mind that gang members do not like to be on foot in a strange area, especially one that's, occupied or dominated, if you will, by their enemies. Therefore, these kind of little commando raids where you run in on foot, they don't really happen as much. So just kind of understand that. And if a neighborhood canvass is conducted and information is received, it is important that the canvass not stop at that point. And let me tell you why. Because if you stopped there, like at the last, if you have like say 5 houses and you go to the second house and you get what you want, if you stop, this might implicate the house or the business, wherever you're at which the canvass was terminated as the source of information, or the rat house, right? So in addition, more information might be available from a source that you haven't found yet. So if you have, 10 houses on a street, contact all 10. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. You're going to want to get as much information as you can. Remember, field interview cards, those FI cards, those gang cards, those are considered the bread and butter of any gang investigator. And if you properly fill them out, this card is going to be an important part of any gang-related investigation. Now, the crime scene itself that involve gangs can be unique, and they can often bring challenges as well. Because often the crime scene is part of a chain of events. When a gang assault occurs, for example, often a chase precedes and follows the assault. So even if it's a drive-by shooting. And that considerably widens the crime scene. You might even have a car-to-car gun battle. So, if vehicles are involved, the assault is probably by a rival gang. If no vehicles appear to have been involved, the suspects might be local. But these are just, kind of bits of information for you to think about. And evidence obtained in gang-related criminal investigations is going to be processed the same way that you would process any other type of crime. Does that make sense? You're going to want to do the exact same thing. You're going to want to photograph graffiti for later identification, and if it's feasible, take photos of gang members and their tattoos. File FI cards on members that are there. even if they're not involved in the incident, vehicles, territory, locations, crimes committed, drug activities, and any other information. Gang members may usually be located within their territory even after they commit a crime, because this is kind of where they hang out. So they might commit the crime and they might just go back to their area and kick it and just kind of hang out. Now, a helpful source of information on gangs is the internet, believe it or not. Thousands of gang-related sites have been posted, especially on Facebook, you guys, okay? It's a great place to look. Social media is a fabulous investigative tool. Now, in addition, investigators can learn much about gangs in their jurisdiction by paying attention to graffiti, which I've said. And graffiti, gangs use graffiti to send the following types of messages. And after we talk about this, we're going to jump into some strategies. So the messages for gang graffiti would be to mark the territory, to disrespect a rival gang member, to memorialize a deceased member, to make a statement, to send a message, to conduct business. So, if you're going to document their graffiti as evidence, you're going to want to kind of take the following steps. Photograph it whole, like all of it, and then in smaller sections so you can see it. Analyze it while it's intact. Remove it, which is a great idea, afterwards. Paint over it, sandblast it, whatever the city does. Archive the picture. Record the colors used, record all the gang monikers, and then record any information that shows that there's some kind of war going on or beef going on with another gang. Does that kind of make sense? And then most cities have, like I said, the anti-graffiti program that covers up the graffiti. So hopefully that helps as far as the investigation goes. Okay, so let's talk about some approaches to the problem. So a straightforward three-prong approach to addressing the gang problem is to apply a balance of prevention, intervention, and suppression strategies. An approach identified as either the comprehensive community-wide gang program model, or more simply put, the Spergel model. So again, that three-prong approach, and I'm not going to go into the whole model, but it covers prevention, intervention, and suppression. Now, another thing that you can use would be gang injunctions. And these are actually pretty cool. They are civil injunctions that are used a lot of times with urban gangs. They are legal tools, which means you're going to go to court, you're going to present your information, and you're going to get an injunction or a court order that basically says that this particular gang can't do what they normally do in this area. So it's a really cool tool, and it's been used a lot. So just kind of by way of summary, it's like a restraining order against this group. It's a civil suit that seeks a court order declaring the gang's behavior a nuisance and asking for special rules that are directed towards that gang's activity. And injunctions can address the neighborhood's gang problem before it reaches, it kind of gets out of control. And these injunctions have really demonstrated positive effects on some of the neighborhoods that they've been implemented in. And some have had a remarkable effect. Now, in smaller areas, gang nuisance activity can actually be eliminated using these injunctions. In larger areas where these gangs are, they've been entrenched for years, it's going to take a little bit more time in order to reduce the gang membership in that area. And here is an example from the Los Angeles LAPD looking at the top targeted gangs and gang injunctions. And you can see the different gangs that are there. So just a little bit of information on gang injunctions. As it relates to collaboration, again, we're still talking about ways to kind of, deal with gangs. Collaboration is one of them. So, collaboration among law enforcement agencies can greatly enhance efforts to cope with the gang problem. Multi-agency task forces can bring together different perspectives and focus human labor efforts on resources towards a common goal, providing a more effective response to the issue of gangs. So it's not all about just maybe arresting people, right? And even though law enforcement unquestionably plays a major role in effectively combating the gang problem, partnerships with the community, things like schools, etc., they really increase the likelihood of a successful response. And there is a gang model that is out there. It's the OJJDP. It's the comprehensive gang model for the gang reduction program, and it's based on many, many years of experience, and it's one that a lot of agencies follow. Excuse me. If you want to learn more about that, you can look it up, or you can read about it in the textbook. So what are some tactics then? So we talked a little bit about some efforts and things like that. Well, what are some tactics as it relates to maybe prosecution or something like that? So a gang investigator should form a close partnership with the gang prosecutor. And most prosecuting offices, they have a special folks that just do gang cases. And each really must be available to each other as much as possible, because again, you're going to be exchanging a lot of information. And doing it this way ensures critical input in the early stages of a case and the swift reaction to witness intimidation or something that might happen later. Now, one valuable and effective tactic in prosecuting gang-related crime is to make use of the conspiracy laws, such as the Federal Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organization Act, or the RICO Act. Another one would be to maybe apply federal charges. And so you're charging at a federal level instead of at a state level. And another tactic via the prosecution might be to offer no parole. So, I mean, these are some different things. Now, gang members typically will use two common defenses as it relates to prosecution. And these two most common used defenses, the strategies, are going to be diminished capacity, meaning that they were under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time they did the crime, or self-defense. Now, some states don't adhere to diminished capacity as a defense anymore, but some do. But those are typically the two, and self-defense, of course, is the first. That's the typical defense that most gang members will use. Well, they pointed a gun at me first, they shot at me first, etc. So, and that makes sense, right? And so here are some agencies that will help you on the federal level. So these are some resources that are out there. You have the National Gang Intelligence Center, the National Gang Targeting Enforcement and Coordination Center, and then you have the National Youth Gang Center. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about those other groups, and we're going to look a little bit at bias and hate crime, and we're going to touch on ritualistic crime, but just a little bit. The reason I have this individual's picture up is that while we are talking about bias and hate crime, I want you to understand that we need to understand that people aren't always the same. And that doesn't mean that you basically turn your back on a criminal or anything. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that, for instance, this individual here, Mr. Leiden, he was a pretty hardcore white supremacist gang member. And you can play his little video if you want, and he'll give you his information. He now works out at the Simon Wiesenthal Center talking about how he has turned his life around. And for many, many years, he has advocated for the rights of everybody. So he isn't like he was. So I just want you to know that while we're going to talk a little bit about bias and hate, kind of at an overview level, and then we're going to talk a little bit about ritualistic crime, that not everybody stays the same throughout their entire life. Okay, so here we go. So in addition to what we've talked about, the street gangs, law enforcement is often confronted with the criminal activities of hate groups. And hate is a complex subject that can be divided into two general categories: rational and irrational. Unjust acts inspire rational hate. Hatred of a person based on race, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or national origin constitutes irrational hate. So generically, a bias crime or a hate crime is a traditional criminal act such as murder, arson, or vandalism with the added element of bias. Does that make sense? Which means it is committed because of someone's actual or perceived membership in a particular group. So again, and it's going to be the normal crimes. It's going to be vandalism, but depending upon how they do it, it's going to be a bias crime or a hate crime. It's going to be murder, but depending upon, does that kind of make sense? And hate crime is not a new development in our country. It's probably existed in America for more than 300 years. But let's talk a little bit about some reasons. Again, we're not going to go through every single portion here. But what might be some reasons? Well, one would be that it's motivated by bigotry, hatred against a specific group of people. And typically, race is the primary motivation. And African Americans are often the victims of these types of crimes. Now, one thing to remember, hate itself, while it's horrible and it's disgusting and it's something you don't want to see, it's not a crime in itself. The freedom to feel hatred is, in fact, a protected civil liberty. However, when that feeling is translated into some type of action, then it becomes a criminal offense. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody. So Congress, if we're going to define it now, has defined a hate crime as a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, ethnic origin, or sexual orientation. So that's one of the definitions from by Congress. And the FBI publishes yearly a breakdown of these bias-based type crimes. So every year they'll publish this. And so the textbook gives you the, the 2013 numbers. You can actually go on the FBI's website if you want to see any updated numbers. But I didn't put them in there because I wanted to stay consistent with the book. But according to the FBI, of the 5,922 bias incidents in 2013, 48.5% were motivated by race. So remember, we talked about how race was number one. Okay. 20.8% sexual orientation, 17.4% religion, 11.1% ethnicity, origin, and about 1.5% on disability. Now, while again, I didn't post the new numbers, I want you to go look. This is kind of like a little, not an assignment, but take a look. Find the 2018 breakdown of numbers. And while you're going to see some things are the same, like this one, race will be the number one factor, but then I want you to tell me what the number two factor is, because you're going to see a change. All right, and that's just kind of a little challenge to you. So what are some groups? And we're not going to dive into each group, but these, some hate groups would be the skinheads, certain Christian identity groups, the KKK, black separatists, white supremacists, neo-Nazis. So all of these are examples of different types of hate groups. And again, there are plenty of places that you can go to find these different groups. So how do we respond to them? So we're going to want to respond promptly to the reports of a hate crime, of course. Attempt to reduce the victim's fears, because you're going to be upset, and determine the exact type of prejudice involved. Investigators should ask the following questions to determine whether an incident was hate or bias motivated. So here's a couple of different questions. Was the victim a member of a targeted class and outnumbered? Were the offenders from a different racial or ethnic group than the victim? And did the offender use bias-based language, including slang? And if they did, what was it? So it's important to know that because you're going to have to determine between those two things that I started talking about at the beginning of the chapter, hate or bias. And we talked about the difference between those two. So here would be I'll let you look at it. Remember, we talked about it's a crime. It's the crime of vandalism. But because of the way that it's done, this is a church building, by the way, it could be either a hate crime or a bias crime. Well, you tell me, or you think about which one it might fall underneath. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about it later. Okay, so what are some efforts? How can we combat these types of crimes? Well, actually, I'm going to add one more thing in the investigative thing. So, again, as part of your investigation, you need to differentiate between hate crimes and hate incidents. So, hate incidents involve behaviors that, though motivated by bias against a victim's race, religion, ethnic, national origin, gender, age, disability, or sexual orientation, are not criminal acts. Hostile or hateful speech or other disrespectful, discriminatory behavior may be motivated by bias, but it's not illegal. So just a little bit more information. But now, how do you combat these types of crimes? So, no national consensus exists about whether hate crimes should be a separate crime, and those supporting, hate crime statutes disagree about what should be included. And states vary greatly in the legislation related to hate crimes. The most common elements of hate crime legislation include things like enhanced penalties or criminal penalties for vandalism of religious institutions, and then especially collection of data. And legislation must also keep up with technology that's used to spread hate. So there's a lot of things at the legislative level that we could do. Okay, so I know that was just touching on the hate and bias, but I want to move into and use the remaining time to talk about ritualistic crime. Now, you're not going to run into this quite a bit, but you might see some. So ritualistic crimes are most often associated with cults or occult groups. And a cult is a system of religious beliefs and rituals. It also refers to those who practice those beliefs. Now, one informal definition of a cult is any religion other than your own, which we know that's not true really, or it shouldn't be. And the term is often applied to religious or mystical groups that society really doesn't understand. But it's not our job to say that your religion isn't a religion. Okay, but I wanted you to know what the definition of a cult is. So just keep it simple. A cult refers to, a system of religious beliefs and rituals and those who practice those. Okay. Now, most cults involve some form of worship and followers dedicated to the concepts that are promoted by that particular leader. So an example could be, if you remember the People's Temple, led by Jim Jones in the 70s, and maybe you're not quite old enough to remember that, had hundreds of followers move to Jonestown, a small rural community in Guyana. And after being involved in the murders of a congressman and 3 journalists who were investigating what was happening in their cult, he ordered 900 followers to basically commit suicide by drinking the Kool-Aid. And that's, you can probably figure out maybe that's where that phrase came from. But a lot of these individuals are, they talk well, they speak well, they're charismatic, and people tend to follow them. But this is the aftermath of what happened. So, and of course, not just one investigator would investigate something like this, it would be many. Another one quickly, an example would be the Branch Davidians, headed by David Koresh. And if you remember, he clashed with federal agents that were attempting a raid on their compound back in 1993, and weapons to include a .50 caliber machine gun were found inside of Koresh's church and the other buildings. And this was a 51-day standoff where 4 agents were killed, 31 others were wounded, and 70 people inside of the building were actually killed. And this is what the compound looked like, and this is what happened when it basically caught on fire. So again, you would not be the only investigator, but these are some things that fall within the realm of ritualistic. And on page 645 in your textbook, it talks about some terminology and some symbols. And these might be things that you would want to look for if you start seeing certain symbols that are drawn on, let's say, other churches, like the picture that I showed you earlier. Or you start to see some of these different words. So, like Antichrist, or coven, hand of glory, incantation, occult, ritual. So all of these different things, and they have different meanings. And the symbols actually mean different things as well. So among the satanic and occult symbols are the circle, which symbolizes totality and wholeness within which these ceremonies are often performed. So they have this circle, and the ceremony is inside of it. The inverted cross, which basically mocks the Christian cross. The goat's head, symbolizing the devil. The heart, symbolizing the center of life. The hexagram, which, if that's a six-pointed star, is reported to protect and control demons. The pentagram, that's the five-pointed star, representing the four elements of earth, surmounted by the spirit, and the horned hand, a hand signal of recognition used between those members of each group. And even colors, black represents darkness or evil, blue would be like sadness, and green would be nature or restfulness, red would be blood, and white would be purity, and then yellow would be power or even wealth. So there's a lot for you to remember. So just like with street gangs, they have their symbols and things like that. Now, typically they don't quite dress the way that they do, as easily or recognizable as regular, street gangs. So who commits this ritualistic crimes? And how do we kind of categorize them? So a ritualistic crime is basically an unlawful act committed within the context of a ceremony. And investigating these crimes, you're supposed to, your job is to investigate the crime, not the religion. So, keep that in mind. And there's three levels of activity or involvement. There's those that kind of dabble in it, right? So they just kind of, they're playing around with it. They are intermittently involved in the occult. And they have kind of a strong or a curious interest in the supernatural. And then you have, those that are, more seriously involved. They're involved at, to that serious involvement level. And then finally, you have the criminal involvement, where they're actually performing some of these rituals themselves. So then who commits these ritualistic crimes? So a psychological profile of males and females involved in the occult reveals that they tend to be creative or imaginative, curious, daring, and thus intelligent and well-educated, yet frequently they tend to be underachievers. And although they are egocentric in a sense, they have low self-esteem and have suffered things like peer rejection or some other type of persecution. They come from various social and economic backgrounds and can be any age, although the average is like 13 to 24. That's typically the most common. And there are a variety of races or nationalities or religions. And interestingly, few Jewish individuals are involved in Satanism. And I think it's, and the book states it, and I think that's it, that Judaism does not emphasize the devil. Therefore, it's probably not brought up as much. But a number of factors might lead a person to the occult involvement, including family alienation, insecurity, a quest for personal power, some unfulfilled ambition, a spiritual search for answers, nonconformity, rebellion, a desire for adventure or excitement, the need for attention, and a need to escape reality. So these are some things. And remember I told you before, so who commits them? Well, with street gangs, we have the clothing and the colors and things that they wear outside, on their body. You can see it. Well, although personal appearance of those involved in the occult activity is quite normal, Some may adopt a less than mainstream look. So for example, they may dress entirely in black or dark clothing. Now, just because they're wearing that doesn't mean they're involved in the occult. These are just guidelines. They may pierce various parts of their bodies. They might grow their hair long or dye it, or wear chains as implements of confinement. Some might even wear heavy eyeshadow or white makeup and appear to be more death-like, if you will. Maybe heavy boots or sometimes tattoos that depict serpents or skulls or any other type of occult symbols. And then if you can look closely, sometimes you might see scars that indicate cutting or burning or whipping. But typically, as I said at the beginning of this, that a lot of the individuals, they kind of dress like you and I, kind of normal, but some don't. Now, when you talk about the actual crime scene itself, you might run across what you see right here. So, occult reports and activities are investigated in much the same way as any other crime. You're going to want to interview the people who report the incident, prepare reports concerning any witnesses or alleged victims of criminal activity. And if there's no criminal activity, then you're still going to want to write a report so you can document it, but you're going to want to take photos and sketch the symbols, describe the colors found, measure the objects, and preserve all objects at the scene as evidence. Work from the outside perimeter to the center or the focal point of the site. Does that make sense? Just like in a crime scene, kind of. Especially when you do photos. You're going to photo from outside, remember, and then work your way in. Now, one challenge in investigating ritualistic crime is determining that an act is in fact motivated by a religious belief system rather than by hate or bias, right? Some crimes, such as arson or vandalism, may not initially present clearly as one type of crime or another, particularly when the victim or target has some religious component, such as a church or a cemetery. So understanding the motivations behind these crimes will really help you as an investigator distinguish whether an act is rooted in hate or ritualism. And most of the signs, symbols, and other indicators of ritualistic crime discussed that I'm going to talk about here in just a minute are going to be found at the crime scene, of a hate crime, whereas derogatory or hate-filled, verbalizations, graffiti, or other written evidence are often present at are going to be, seen at bias crimes. So again, here's a picture of a crime scene. And here's another crime scene where they actually found some buried bodies. So, there's a lot of, again, just thorough investigation. Okay, so what are some signs then of this ritualistic, this cult-related activity? So I'm going to kind of go through these quickly, and we'll talk about them. So some signs might be, for ritualistic crime, might be altars, or animal parts, or ashes or bowls with powder. Sometimes bells or gongs or drums, maybe bottles that have blood in them, body paint, body parts, booby traps, books on Satanism, candles, a cauldron for a fire, chalices, coffins, crystals, daggers, sometimes hoods or robes, inverted crosses, or jewelry like medallions, those with satanic symbols. Even occult games like Ouija boards or tarot cards. These are signs of cult-related activity. Okay. What about indicators of ritualistic crimes? Well, indicators that criminal activity may be cult-related include, symbols, candles, again, makeshift altars, bones, cult-related books, maybe swords, daggers, chalices. As it relates to animal deaths, you might, sometimes there might be circumstances where you'll get a call of an animal death. So unusual circumstances surrounding animal deaths may be important indicators of satanic or cult activity. And, some of the circumstances connected with dead animals, should be noted. So no blood, meaning that the blood has been drained from the animal. You're going to want to check that. Because just a dead animal could just be a dead animal, right? But a dead animal with no blood might be something else. An inverted cross carved on the animal, specifically on the chest. Maybe the head was cut off. Or maybe other body parts or organs were removed. What about homicides? Well, ritual homicides committed by true believers reflect a serious knowledge of the particular theology, a high level of skill and meticulous attention to detail. The perpetrator considers the murder to be a sacred act, and the crime scene will reflect it. So at the scene of a homicide investigation, you may see this, okay? Missing body parts, or the heart, genitals, the tongue, a left hand or an index finger, scarring between the index finger and the thumb or inside the wrist from past rituals involving, members' blood. Maybe the blood is drained from the body. Any other type of symbols like a pentagram. Tattoos on the person's armpits or on the bottom of their feet. Wax drippings or oils or incense on the body. Semen inside or on or near the body. Urine or human animal feces smeared on the body. The victim is undressed. The body is painted up or tied. Any type of neck wounds. So all of these are things that you need to really pay attention to. Okay? Investigating satanic serial killings. So serial killings may be linked to satanic-like rituals, the murder act itself, as well as the killer's behavior following the murder. And serial killings frequently linked to Satanism include, remember Charles Manson? Had links with the process. That was a satanic group. And many of the murders committed by Manson and his followers had those ritualistic overtones. The Son of Sam case, murders involving David Berkowitz, are claimed by author Maury Terry. And they have, it was kind of a conspiracy among a satanic cult. There were some brutal, vicious serial killers in that group. And then the Night Stalker, remember Richard Ramirez? He had a pentagram on the palm of his hand. He wrote satanic graffiti on the walls of some of the victims' homes. And he was obsessed with AC/DC's song, the album, Highway to Hell, featuring the song, if you remember, Night Stalker. And Ramirez would sometimes yell out, "Hail Satan." So, again, just a lot of different things that you have to kind of consider as it relates to these types of crimes. And there's a picture of Mr. Ramirez. And here's all of the killings that he did if you were interested. So, he was a serial killer that had that satanic attachment. Now, again, some challenges would be separating the belief system from the illegal acts, and of course the sensationalism that accompanies these types of crimes, because once the press gets a hold of that, it's definitely going to be something that they're going to want to get out there as well. Okay, so in summary, to wrap things up, belonging to a gang is not illegal in this country. Activities of gang members frequently are illegal. Investigating bias or hate crimes and ritualistic crimes is challenging. Ritualistic crimes are often associated with the occult. And investigate the crime, not the belief system. So that's going to conclude our lecture for today. So that will conclude part 2, chapter 19, talking about gangs and other dangerous groups. Until next time.